Hi friends. A few weeks ago, I got one of those social media memory notifications, and you know the ones, right? And it pulled up old Facebook albums from my daughter's graduations, high school, college, the celebrations, all of those big turning points that happened this time of year, and the ones that took place before they were right about to make a major life transition. My empty nest journey honestly felt like a lifetime ago, but I can still remember exactly how it felt. Now, even if your kids have been gone for years, stay with me here because what I really want to talk about today goes well beyond just the empty nest itself. I remember the countdown before my oldest daughter left for college, and we're coming up on 20 years here in a few months, and I was 40 years old at the time. And I remember buying all the things, that she would need, just trying to make sure that she had everything to make her life easier. And underneath all of that practical preparation was this ache that I didn't quite know what to do with, because it wasn't that I didn't want her to go. Of course I wanted her to go. That is what we raise them for. But wanting the best for your child doesn't mean that you don't also grieve the life that's changing inside your own home. And since it's graduation season right now, I know there are parents standing right at the edge of this. Maybe you've already experienced it, but this conversation is still relevant for you too. Maybe your child is graduating from high school and heading to college, or they're finishing college and moving away for work, or maybe they're moving into their first apartment. And you may be incredibly proud of them, excited for them. And you may know logically that this is healthy and normal and exactly the way it's supposed to be and what's supposed to happen. But underneath all of that is this quiet dread, because you know that your daily life is about to feel very different. So I want to talk about what it actually felt like for me, what helped me get through it, and what I wish I would understood earlier. And I learned that my children could be the greatest loves of my life without being responsible for my happiness. Having an empty nest can be a struggle, even when you see it coming. And that's the strange part. It's usually not a surprise, right? You know that they're going to grow up and that they are going to graduate. And you know that they may go to college or move out and start a job. And these are natural progressions. But knowing something is coming and being emotionally ready for it are two completely different things. For 18 years or more, you're deeply involved in the day-to-day reality of your child's life. And you know what they eat, you know when they're sick, you know when they're happy and when they're struggling. And even if they don't say it to you, you know their friends and routines and activities, and you also know when something feels off just by the way that they come through the door. And especially as mothers, so much of our identity can get wrapped around that daily care. And when my daughters were growing up, they were involved in a lot of things, clubs and sports and concert band and marching band and everything that those activities involved. But truly, when you're raising your children, you are in their orbit. Your day is shaped around them. Your calendar is shaped around them, and your mental energy is constantly tracking them. And you may not even realize how much of your mind is occupied with their needs until suddenly it isn't. At least not in the same way. And then little by little, that changes. They leave for college, they move into an apartment or start a job, maybe far away, and suddenly you don't know what they had for dinner. You don't know if they're overwhelmed. You don't know if someone hurt their feelings. You don't know if they're lonely and tired. And that loss of knowing is hard. Not because you think you should control their lives, but because for so long, loving them meant knowing the details. And then one day, loving them means letting go of the details. And that's not always easy. When my oldest daughter first went to college in 2006, I'll be honest, I felt like my life was ending. And I know that sounds dramatic, but emotionally, that is how it felt. She was only about an hour and a half away. And, you would have thought that she had moved to another country based on how I reacted internally and externally. And texting back in 2006 was fairly new at that point. No smartphones, there was no Find My Friends, social media was different. There barely was social media, MySpace, Facebook, when it was mostly for college students. And we didn't have that same constant connection potential that exists now. So when she left, it felt like a real and significant separation. She finished her bachelor's degree, moved out of state for work and to complete her postgraduate degree. Then in 2012, my youngest left for college, graduated in 26, and moved to the Midwest for her first job as a software engineer. So I had 10 solid years of the transition of my kids leaving. Briefly coming home from summers and then either back to school or then that final official move out. And honestly, I don't know what was worse, the first leaving or the last. The first leaving was brutal because I had never felt that kind of shift before, The last leaving was brutal because the house just changed. There wasn't a younger child still at home to keep that rhythm going, and there wasn't another school year to prepare for, in the same way. It was just different. And different can feel devastating when your whole life to date has been built around loving and caring for people who will now need you less. And when they go off to college or they move out, you're also faced with the physical reminders. The room is still there. Many of their belongings are still there. Their bed looks like their bed. And, you walk past that room and you can almost just see them in there, right? On their phone or on their computer or laughing with their friends. And the room becomes this strange little museum of a life that is still connected to you, but no longer happening under your roof. And the grief can come from the smallest things. It may hit you at the grocery store when you automatically reach for something that they've always loved before you catch yourself. Or maybe it's just when you see that water bottle sitting on the table from when they were home before they moved. And I think it's important to say that, because sometimes we judge ourselves for grieving a change that is actually good. Your child leaving is healthy. It may be exciting. It may be exactly what should happen. And you can still feel sad. Those things can exist at the same time. You can be proud and grateful and heartbroken. And you can want them to go and still miss who you were when they were there. Because part of what you're grieving isn't only their presence, you're grieving a version of your own life that's changed. Now, in raising my daughters, I always believed it was my responsibility to do anything and everything I could to help them. And I still believe in helping your children, and I believe in showing up. But looking back, I can see that, there were a lot of times that I tried too hard to do things for them instead of helping them become independently responsible for some of those things themselves. And I don't say that to beat myself up in any way, I think a lot of us do that from love. But the last thing you would ever want is for them to become so dependent on you that they can't survive on their own. You're just thinking, I can help. I can make this easier. But part of parenting is learning that love has to evolve. And it's still evolving for me. 20 years later. When they're little, love looks like doing almost everything for them, right? When they're teenagers, love starts to look more like guiding them and just having their back. And when they become adults, love has to become something else again. It has to become trust and respect. And it has to become allowing them to have a life that is not managed by you. One of my favorite quotes, and there are many that have shaped my thinking over the years, is a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. A ship sitting safely in the harbor is protected, it's close, it's visible, you can keep an eye on it. But that isn't the purpose of a ship. A ship is meant for the water and it's meant to leave the dock, right? It's meant for adventures. And our children are like that. We create these human beings and we nurture them and we love them so deeply that it can feel almost impossible to imagine them outside of our reach. But they were not built to stay in our harbor forever. They deserve the chance to exist beyond our walls. And they deserve to find out what kind of life feels right to them. And sending them into their own lives is not a failure of parenting. It is the point of parenting. If they want to leave, if they feel capable of leaving, then that means something went right. That doesn't mean it won't hurt. It means the hurt has meaning. So here's the part that I think matters most, and it's something that I had to learn the hard way. My children could not be responsible for my happiness. They could be deeply loved by me. They could be the most important parts of me. They could be a huge part of my life, but they could not be the thing that made my life, feel like it's worth living. I had to become that was my work. And I don't mean that in a cold way. And I don't mean that we're supposed to snap out of it and become instantly self-actualized. I mean that slowly over time, we have to build a life that can hold our love for them without collapsing when they're not physically present. Because when you miss your kids, it can be very easy to interpret their independence as rejection. They will make choices differently than you would, but most of the time, their independence is not a rejection of you. It is their life becoming their own. They should be allowed to grow without feeling guilty for growing. And they should be allowed to enjoy their own lives without worrying that you are sitting at home devastated by their absence. And that's not their responsibility, and it's not freedom, and that's a leash made out of guilt. And I don't think most of us actually want that at all, even when we're hurting, right? Looking back, one thing that I wish I had done earlier was begin building my own next chapter sooner. And it not because I was eager for my daughters to leave, because I wasn't, but because I wish I had understood that I was going to need personally something to grow into as well. I'd always had my own interests, and I've always loved to garden and plants, and I've always been a voracious learner. I've always had stacks of books waiting for me and a new documentary that I couldn't wait to watch and dive into. So the foundation was there, but it still took real intention to refocus, and it didn't happen overnight. I hadn't read books about this phase, and I didn't really have a model for what it should look like for me. My closest friends were in different situations, and with their kids might be, they were going to local colleges, or they had younger children that were still at home. So I had to figure it out for myself, So here's some of what I found. One of the big things for me was getting a library card. If you don't already have one, I cannot overstate this. The library is basically a giant free bookstore. And after my daughter graduated, I remember heading to the library. I hadn't been there for my own purposes in a few years, and coming back with this huge stack of books and looking forward to diving in. Also, libraries have community boards and classes and local events and groups that you might even not, that you don't even know they exist. If there's books you've always talked about reading, now is the time. Truly, stop talking about it and start. The library has a vast audiobook selection too, if you prefer that method. Start walking, jogging in your neighborhood. Start small. Walk around the block maybe with a friend, Your body deserves that care. My husband and I started traveling more, just day trips, weekends, historical places that I'd always wanted to see, little towns, that I always meant to visit. And my husband and I, we were starting our new chapter as well, because Chad and I had only been married for about 5 years when my youngest daughter graduated from college in 2016. So you don't have to wait for a big expensive trip. Just start going places. And somewhere in the middle of my empty nest years, I taught myself how to crochet. And, that sounds like a small thing, but it was not small to me. I had to learn stitches and patterns and make mistakes and pull things apart and start over again. I had to keep going when I had no idea what I was doing. And there is something deeply, deeply satisfying about proving to yourself that you can still learn something new. I've made many Afghans and gifts over the years, and I'm genuinely proud of my tenacity on that front. My husband and I also spent a lot of time gaming online together. And I know that might not be everyone's picture of a meaningful empty nest activity, but honestly, you'd be surprised. Sometimes rebuilding your life doesn't have to look poetic. Sometimes it just looks like laughing together over a game, or maybe being terrible at something for a while. And that counts too. And the point is not that everyone should crochet or game or garden or travel. The point is that your life needs places for your energy to go. For years, so much of that energy went towards your children. And when that daily focus changes, the energy doesn't just disappear. It has to be redirected somewhere. And if it isn't, it can turn into resentment or anxiety, or the temptation to hover around your adult children. And one of the most beautiful things that can happen if we allow it, is that the relationship with our children can become something new. You know, you're not losing your children. You're losing a certain version of daily motherhood. And yes, that deserves to be mourned. But if you can give them room, then something else can grow. You can get to know them as adults. You know, you hear their opinions. You watch them build relationships and careers of their own, you know, their own lives. You see what became of them when they were no longer under your roof every day. And there's something really beautiful about that. But it only has room to become beautiful if we don't cling so tightly to the old role that we smother the new relationship. Adult children still need parents, you know, just not in the same way. They may need us as listeners or a safe place, you know, or as people who respect their choices and celebrate their independence. They may want advice sometimes, but not constant instruction. And the love that comes with guilt not attached to it. That's the kind of motherhood, and it can feel quieter at first and maybe less important, but it is still important because it requires us to loosen our grip. And if you are facing an empty nest, or you're already in one and it feels harder than you expected, you know, you're not strange for struggling. It is a major life transition, and it changes your home and your routines and your identity and your relationships, and it makes complete sense if it hurts. But I also want to say clearly that this is not the end of your life. It may be the end of a particular chapter, and that chapter may have been precious beyond words, but there is still life waiting for you. There's still books to read and places to go and things to learn. And your children, if you give them that freedom, may come back to you in a new way, not as children who need you for everything, but as adults who know they are loved without being trapped by that love. And it is a beautiful thing to offer yourself. The nest might be empty, but you are not. Thanks for being here, y'all, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.